There is a real yearning within the Labour Party for us to return to the central purpose of the Labour Party, born of working men and women for working men and women, to actually focus on the needs of working New Zealanders, knowing that when working New Zealanders are secure, then they'll look after the vulnerable.
If you think about the way the world was before the agricultural revolution, you had two constraints on production. You essentially had the land and the productivity of the land and the labour that worked that land. And those two things determined the output that was available. When the Industrial Revolution came along and you got technologies and fossil fuels and so on, you started to get the accumulation of capital and the use of capital to increase productivity and increase output. And so what started then was a contest between capital and labour. What's happening now is that I think that situation's changing. And whether it's changing or it's changed, and it comes back to the point you made, David, about the sort of separation between the amount of work and the amount of output that's available. And what we're seeing now is an increasing surplus of labour as global population continues to grow. But the available resource for that population to go out and exploit in order to create output is reducing. But now the constraint is moving back to land, environment effectively, and capital, and as a result of that, labour's going into surplus, into structural surplus. And as that happens, the labour has a constituency. You are the constituency of labour, and capital has a constituency as well, but land doesn't have such a constituency because it doesn't have a voice in the same way. There are people who own the capital, but the people who own the land are really capitalists rather than people who are protecting the land. And the consequence of that is a weakening of the power of labour at the same time as there's not enough support for the land as an attribute or as a resource. And so what you're seeing is the forces of capital are in fact becoming more powerful relative to labour. And as the forces of capital become more powerful, they're more able to set the rules, and they set the rules, as you know, they set the rules so that more of the returns go to capital, so they set the rules in their own interests. You know, we had a long period of time where we had computers and robotics, and they were toys or they were things that, you know, enhanced our experience. But now we're seeing a lot of substitution of computers and robotics and other information technology for labour. And most of that substitution is actually taking place in the middle of the income structure. At the high end of the income structure, there's an increasing premium for talent, and there's very high mobility of that talent. And as a result of that, prices for that talent are being bid up. The work in the middle is decreasing because of technology, and those people don't have the skills to go up and compete in that really high talent area that's mobile. And so what they do is they reduce their price and go down and compete in the lower income occupations, putting downward pressure on the income that's available in those occupations. The internet. What the internet is doing is it's actually changing the economics of the firm. So the reason we had firms, the reason we had businesses, and what determined the size of the business was really how difficult it was to communicate and coordinate inside the firm relative to how difficult it was to communicate and coordinate between firms. So when communication and coordination was quite difficult, firms were pretty big because it was much easier to communicate inside them. As communication costs and essentially transaction costs come down as a result of the internet, it becomes easier to communicate between firms, and so firm size falls and it becomes much easier to contract.
If you're going to ask me what I see coming over the horizon in the long term for jobs and for work, I start with the environment and energy. That there is a fundamental set of issues about energy provision and sustainable environments that may have absolutely dramatic long-term implications for the way in which we think about work. We have no idea really how that may turn out. There's a second big issue, which is political stability. In political theory terms, we're in what they call a post-Westphalian world, a world where wars are no longer fought between countries, but are fought between movements that have no commitment to the boundaries and to the rules, if you like, the regulatory frameworks that we've fought wars on since the 17th century. And I look at ISIS, and I look at a whole series of arrangements that you see emerging around the world where states are unable to deal with the challenges they're facing. Some of you may have been looking at the more recent work on artificial intelligence and what they may be doing and thinking of using artificial intelligence for, to actually replace human beings altogether. And there are people already hypothesizing levels of quality of technology that will make us even more redundant. If you look at job creation in somewhere like the US in the last 2 or 3 years, the net job creation has primarily come from work that is skilled, high status, complex, and it's about problem solving and relational networking type behaviours. Job creation is not coming even from advanced manufacturing. It's not coming in places like the service sector. It's not coming in those traditional sectors that used to be the soaking up opportunity for surplus labour. As we just heard, traditional jobs are in fact in this process being pushed down. And we observe that very clearly in New Zealand, where we have increasingly large numbers of people towards the minimum wage, but a layer of people at the top end in these more complex jobs doing relatively well. And that's a universal pattern across mature economies. And what's interesting, even when we see major changes going up the value curve on manufacturing, for example, it creates relatively few jobs because it's new skilled manufacturing workers using new technologies, new capital, not absorbing large amounts of labour. We've still got skill shortages because we're not matching the demand to the training needs that come in, that can be put in place. What is clear is if you haven't got a tertiary education, you're going to be disadvantaged. If you do not complete secondary, you are almost destined to be down in the lower end of the labour market. The OECD data is quite clear that for the higher skilled jobs, you're going to have tertiary as a minimum qualification. And if you think about the state of our education system and what it's achieving at the moment, you begin to wonder about the possibilities of what that means for New Zealand. The current neoliberal mindset either refuses to address those issues or is so actively engaged in benefiting from it that it will not tackle it. We see it in spades in our current government. Bill English is a very intelligent man. There is no question about that. Bill English, I think, must know part of the time he's talking rant nonsense when he talks to us, right? Because the model he's purveying is one that is going to condemn people into this terrible separation between the well-paid elite and the vast mass of people who are going to be unequally, unfairly, and not decently rewarded. We have to change that mindset. That's the only way that we can move forward, not just here, but internationally.
The reality is technology is moving so fast in so many areas that jobs are going to disappear and they're going to migrate. So they're going to move from here because we don't have scale. They're going to move from here because we've focused on low value work for too long. There's no simple message. There's only one, which is 3 horizons. There's business as usual. Keep doing what you're doing, but do it better. We've been doing that for about 40 decades. We've just kept getting better and better and better at doing low value work. It's called farming. And there's a limit to how much we can extract out of the land, and our population keeps growing, so we don't do so well and we start borrowing. Then there's a transition environment, a transition horizon, where we actually have to start doing things differently with an end in mind. And that's where we should be today. And the economic policies that were actually put forward by the Labour Party in the last election were actually transitional policies to actually set us on the right path to a different economy. And they were complicated and very few people understood them, but I did. I was with David Parker when we went around the world and saw all the economists and asked all the hard questions and found out that this is absolutely a global problem. It's not just us, it's happening all over the world. So the good news is, how many people are we? 4.5 million. How many people do we have to feed? 4.5 million. We don't have to solve the world's problems. We just have to be the best to make sure we protect 4.5 million families, 4.5 million jobs. To do that, we have to become the best at a whole lot of things. which starts with education, which starts with entrepreneurship, which starts with, making sure our kids are being channeled into the right and productive jobs, and then we have to compete. Compete with China, compete with Germany, compete with everyone, because somebody is going to get that job. Somebody is going to build that car. Somebody is going to build the factory that builds the car. Somebody is going to build the drill bit that's in the factory that builds the car. Somebody. Why can't it be us? And that's the only future that we have.
Industrialisation has been the root out of poverty for most countries. You see China, they've lifted themselves out of poverty by using the benefit of their lower labour costs for their population. They've taken our manufacturing off us and done it over there. And yet now, those opportunities don't look like they're going to be open to Africa, because the labour going into industrial output is just going down through the floor, even in places like China. Obviously, we have to do as much as we can to push towards higher value products and services and be more skilled in what we do in order to compete in this incredibly competitive world. But I wonder that even if we do that, whether we're going to have an excess of labour. My suspicion is we're going to. And I wonder if we've shielded ourselves from that in the last couple of decades by keeping people in education longer. People are surviving longer in retirement, and that has in fact masked some of these trends that have already been happening and look like they're going to become even more extreme.
As agricultural resources, as resources generally become scarcer, the fact that we've got a lot of them will become even more of an asset than it has been in the past. So the first thing we need to do is use our technologies and use our business smarts and so on, and take that agricultural produce that gives us an advantage in primary produce and add value to it, and control the downstream value chains, and where we can use branding and so on to capture some of the benefits from that. And then the question becomes, what do we do with the rest of the people? Making cars probably is a scale business, and New Zealand's too small to make cars, and so we probably can't play in that game. But if you look at the New Zealand businesses that are being successful, many of those businesses have leadership positions in very small niches. And there is a very large number of leadership positions in very small niches that are available. New Zealand has the lowest age of first leaving education in the OECD. So basically, you can't compete in a highly skilled world if you're at the low skill end of it. I was in Denmark and they told me the amazing statistic that the average age of first leaving education there was 29. I think there is a way to do it, but you've got to be clever about it. And I think what we've got is this neoliberal sort of neoclassical mindset sort of deals with capital and labour, but doesn't actually think about the quality of the capital, the quality of labour, and how you are actually strategic. They get involved in getting involved in reaching in and picking winners at the company level, which is the wrong way to do it, but they refrain from picking it at the sector level where there are real opportunities to develop sectors that have advantage, and that's where the game should be being played. Government policy can remedy any of that simply by altering the balances, altering the tax structures and the benefit structures. The government in the end makes a decision about how equal the society is going to be. I think the capital gains tax is a good thing, because New Zealand is one of the only countries that has that, or doesn't have that. Yeah. And I think we can see the consequences of that in terms of, and particularly the advantages in residential housing and the starvation of the productive economy from investment. So there's a bunch of tax settings, I think, that the sort of things you guys are talking about heads in the right direction. My view of the world is that the world's going to become a tougher place, and food's going to be a pretty important thing to have, and technology might be difficult to sustain. I'm a bit of a pessimist on the world. Well, I'd rather have the option to be a peasant in my own country, rather than be put in a position where the food that is produced in my country is shipped out to aristocrats in other countries.
You have to have a way of redistributing wealth, and no one puts up their hand and says, you know what, I want to pay more tax. Nobody does. So you actually have to do it on the basis of legislation, and people have to say, this is what we believe in our society, and we don't have it, because we've become, over a period of time, we've become more and more and more selfish. And I think about I've been in the paper for saying we should repay loans. I've had My last company had $12 million from you guys, thanks very much. And when the company was sold, it stayed with the shareholders. How do you feel about that? It stinks. And so there should be legislation that says you sell your company, it has to go back. You have to pay it back to the government so that it can be reinvested for the next one. And that same principle goes on right through our society. We've got one-way traffic.
One of the critical problems for New Zealand is we're pretty good at inventing things and getting them to a product. We're not so good at commercialising them, and the bit that we lack is we're not very good at entering other countries in terms of our market entry. And so what we would expect, if that was really important for our economy, would be to have something like what we have for the All Blacks. That young person in your business who needs to be trained up, needs to go to a place to learn how to do that, just as we have academies for rugby. Where are you going to send that person to really get a great understanding of how to enter international markets? And the answer is, actually, we don't really have much here. I mean, there's a little bit that people are trying to do now.
The role of creative arts in national identity was understood very well when Helen Clark was Prime Minister, because a country that has that sense of identity and purpose understands itself in so many multiple ways, and the creative arts are absolutely fundamental to that. A country that doesn't value the way it expresses itself in art and literature and poetry and film will never succeed in all the other areas. That's the first thing. The second thing is that creative arts contribute massively to one of the fundamental aspects of the modern economy, which is design.
I would also say something else, and that is that if you're going to have a happy population and you've got a lower need for hours of work, then the arts are an incredibly important part of fulfilment if you're not going to get fulfilment out of work. And it's absolutely wonderful that we've now got automatic washing machines instead of agitator washing machines, and before that sort of corrugated boards. But we do need to have fulfilling lives, and if there's less reliable structure arising out of people's work because there's going to be less of it, then the arts actually become even more important, in my opinion. So, I would have thought that one of the most niggardly things that the current government did, which sort of broke down community spirit and creativity and fulfilment in life, and therefore undermined society generally, was actually the cancellation of the adult community education. It's such a small thing. So, I mean, I personally am of the view that that we are actually on the eve of a very, very difficult thing in the Western world about how we fairly distribute work. And a lot of this conversation here has been about how we make the most of what we have and therefore add as much value and get as much of our share of the world's work as we can, which is a very admirable thing to do, and we should do that. But there's still an underlying trend that we're not going to beat, which is that there will be less, in my opinion, demand for labour than there has been.
You can calculate how much environment you need to support the lifestyle of a person, and you can multiply that up across all the persons on the planet and work out how many planets we need. And at the moment we need about 1.4. We went through one in the 1980s, so we need about 1.4. Population is going to slow, but by 2050 things go on the course that they stay on. We'll need about 2. Now, that's an indication of sustainability. Like 1 is sustainable, 2 is unsustainable. So there has to be some kind of a correction. And climate change, I see 3 drivers really. Climate change is one. The scarcities is the second one. This is demand in relation to the supply of things. And then the third one is ecosystems and the services that we get from ecosystems in variety, bees and honey and water and all those kinds of things, that water cycle that keep us alive. So if all that's going to get constrained, the question is, well, what's going to happen? And then we sort of circle back to this question of politics, because what you see when times get tough is it gets very difficult to govern. And it gets difficult to govern because it becomes hard to raise the taxes that you need to raise in order to provide the services that you need to provide. And if you look through history at what the consequences of that is, usually it's centralisation of power of some kind. And the trouble with centralisation of power is it becomes easier to grab. And so you get contests for the centralisation of power. And you see local people who come up to look after their local communities, who are community organisations, and then they later on get called warlords. And so you end up with this kind of centralisation and then fragmentation as times get tough. And so the presumption that we have and that we all and that we all think of is that the system that we have, democracy, is A, the best one that's available, and B, it's going to be the one that we're going to use to deal with all of these issues. I don't think that follows.
No.
I think we're going into unknown territory. And the way that this plays out will be quite alien to our experiences of the last couple of hundred years.
You know, this is something that I think we can take hope from in New Zealand. You know, we've already got one of the longest unbroken democracies in the world, 160 years. None of Africa or Asia or Africa.
I think Iceland.
Or, yeah, so there's Iceland, there's, you know, Australia, Canada, and there's a couple of little principalities in Europe who can claim a longer democracy than us, but there's very few countries. And actually, during that 160 years, we've led in so many areas, and we can again. So you can be depressed about these things, or you can actually say, well, maybe if we can get these things right, we can actually be a beacon of hope as to how other countries in the world can do it better, so that we can overcome these problems globally rather than just locally. So I'm not one of those people who says that we should wait for the rest of the world to cure these problems before we actually do our bit, because I actually think we can actually, these problems are more solvable in New Zealand because of our scale and our natural advantages and our democracy and our respect for the rule of law and our environmental ethic than they are for a lot of other countries. So let's just get on and do the best we can, and then actually hopefully the world will get a better outcome than it would otherwise do. Well, thank you. Can I thank the three speakers? There's an accumulated wisdom from these three guys that, you know.